Okay, thank you, Nora. So folks, I want to kind of bridge from the hour that we spent last time to the topic for this time. So basically, we have been going through Nora's life in linguistics and anthropology, starting with her undergraduate background. We're now in graduate school at the University of Florida in the anthropology department. And Nora, you've discussed Martha Hardman, and you've discussed your first times in Guatemala, but you still owe us a dissertation. So let's pick it up. And you're in graduate school. What happens next?
Okay. I believe that Tony has made available somewhere a kind of chronology of my work in Guatemala and the kinds of things that went on in a formal sense. That is to say, there was a program here and there was a program there and so on. So that might be a bit of a guide for you. It works out to be a bit of a guide for me too. So in graduate school, after a few years and taking too long and getting a master's degree, as I said, there was this advertisement for needing linguists in Guatemala. And so eventually I convinced myself that I had to do that. So I did. And I went to Guatemala, no Spanish, no knowledge about Mayan languages, but pretty good training in field linguistics, which I'd gotten both as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, and ended up then working with the Proyecto Lingüístico Francisco Marroquín, otherwise known as PLFM, under the direction of Terry Kaufman, who is a very well-known historical linguist. And we worked on whatever he set us to, which was word lists and eliciting all kinds of things like that, and eventually making dictionaries. And so during that period, which was when I was working specifically for the PLFM, was 1972 to 1974. And then I went back in the summers of 77, 78, 79, and 80. I gathered a lot of other data, and it eventually became my dissertation, which was a grammar of Mam, one of the Mayan languages. And it, at the time, there weren't a lot of grammars that had been written. There was a kind of a shift in grammar writing was going on. Now, if you want to write a grammar, there's a million examples out there, the very good grammars. But I didn't have those examples. So I kind of had to make up a lot of what I did. Because there was nobody to really teach grammar writing. It's hard to believe it wasn't that long ago, but there really wasn't that much of a tradition of the kinds of grammars that we work on that was robust enough so that you would know what to do. And you know, I'm all in favor of knowing what to do when you write a dissertation. That's a really important thing. So try to, when you figure out your dissertation topic, think about that. Do I know what to do? And that's important. So I got a lot of data. Some of it I got just by chance, by looking at texts and seeing what kinds of questions I had. Some of it there were a couple of surveys and questionnaires that were beginning to come out. Mostly they were not all that good, but they served as some kind of guide. And eventually then I did get together enough data that I was able to figure out how the grammar worked in that language. And so I wrote a grammar for my dissertation with, if you go back and look at that grammar, you'll notice that there's some strange things because I didn't have that good model of several other grammars out there to guide my steps. And so, you know, when you make things up, sometimes you come up with some weird things, but it all kind of worked. And eventually I got it published with quite a few changes in it, of course, by UT Press, my first big connection with the University of Texas. And so, yes, so that was my dissertation resulting from my fieldwork in Guatemala. The fieldwork itself was for collecting lexical material and writing dictionaries, but I managed to get enough material to actually write a grammar as well, something which did not particularly interest Terry Kaufman, because as a historical linguist, he was interested in the words rather than the structures. And the few things that he gave us to try to guide elicitation of grammatical structures were hopelessly awful, frankly. They didn't work, and they were very complex, pointless sentences that you were supposed to elicit. He didn't know how to do that. So, but we all kind of figured it out on our own, how to figure out the syntax, because Terry couldn't help with that. So that became my dissertation. Now, in the process, as I said before, I was working with this project that was training speakers of the languages in how to do their own linguistics, especially lexical and phonological aspects of the language. And so it followed directly on what I had learned working with Martha Hardman, which is that you need to try to work toward the interests that speakers had and try to teach them things that they could use in their own way to understand their own languages from a analytic perspective, and to be able to describe their own languages also from an analytic perspective. And so I think that I found the opportunities while I was working on the lexical project to be able to do that at every step of the way. Starting with, I told you the story about the people that I worked with from Northern Mom, San Ildefonso Ixtehuacan, wanted to learn how to read and write right away, and they started copying what I was writing. And so it was clear to me at that point that these were people who did want to know how to not only read and write, but ultimately analyze their own languages. And so I kind of regarded it as that then it was part of my responsibility to respond to those obvious desires. They wanted to learn to read and write, well, then I had to teach them. It wasn't a matter of, well, if I have time, I'll teach them to read and write next week. It was, I had to teach them right away because that's what they wanted. And I think that that is a kind of a, something I realized when people want to know something and you know it, then you have a responsibility to teach it to them. Where else are they going to get it if it's not from you? So, so that's what I did. Now, as I said, I continued working in the PLFM in 77, 78, 79, 80 in the summers, because at that point, after I graduated, I got a job. And so I had to actually work during the rest of the year. I was working on a bilingual education project for the Choctaw, the Mississippi Choctaw. And so I went in the summers to Guatemala in those times. And many of you know that at around then there was a major civil war in Guatemala that intervened. So in 78, that war started. It went on from 78 to 84. It was extremely bloody. It was directed by the government 98% against Mayas, not just any old people, but just against Mayas. And the evidence for its bloodiness and the fact that it was directed against Mayas was quite visible. There's a bunch of rivers that go from Guatemala into Mexico. And when I was later in Mexico along the frontier, everybody said that there were all these bodies that floated into Mexico in those rivers, and they were without fail tortured. So it was quite obvious what was going on from the outside, from the in terms of, say, Mexicans looking at local Mexicans looking at these bodies and knowing that there was something really horrendous going on in Guatemala. The news also taught us that something totally horrendous was going on in Guatemala. And I saw some of it. I mean, I saw the last time I went, which was 1980, I got off the plane and took a car into the city to stay the night. And as we drove into the city, I passed another car that had somebody in the back who had been shot in the head. This is not the kind of scene that I'm used to, right? A middle-class academic person from the United States doesn't usually see people who are headshot. So it was made an enormous impression on me, obviously, and it became sort of the flavor of that war. I saw subsequently other people who had been wounded or killed in this particular war. And in fact, a couple of houses down and across the street from where we worked was a major labor organizer had been killed in Huehuetenango. And the splash of blood from his body was on the steps and on the sidewalk for weeks afterward. Nobody cleaned it up because it was making a statement. So there was these kinds of scenes taught me quite a lot about the Civil War in Guatemala. Plus, of course, reading the paper and talking to people and so on. I'm not going to go into what the war was all about at this point, but it was not your usual field work to encounter yourself in the middle of a civil war instead of in the middle of a community more or less at peace, right? So it was unusual. And then I stopped traveling to Guatemala during the war. 1980 was the last time that I could go. People told me not to come back at that point. And so as a consequence, I worked in Mexico for a while. I worked on a language called Teco, which is spoken on both sides of the border and is closely related to MAM, the main language I had worked on. So I found it and I worked on Teco, but that's when I would get these stories about bodies floating into Mexico and so on, because these people were a border community. And so when I worked on Teco, there was no training of speakers involved, unlike the previous work I had done, because Teco was a dying language in Mexico, and all of the speakers were elderly. And they had, as far as I could tell, no interest and no ability to do the kind of work that younger people had been trained to do in our earlier forays. That is to say, one of them was completely illiterate. The other one could read and write with great difficulty. They didn't care about things like grammar and so on. They liked their language and they were able to speak it, but it just was not a group in which training was, I think, a viable option. And that is something that you would probably often run into if you're working on a real dying language, that the people who are speakers of that language are not people that you can teach to be linguists. It's who are the people you can teach to be linguists? Well, in my experience, pretty young people. The people that I had the most success with were people in their 20s or even earlier. I would like to, if Thelma wouldn't mind, I would like to bring her up again. In 1997, she was part of a very large group that I and other people taught linguistics to, and she was at the time 18, and she was absolutely dynamite at learning how to do linguistics on her own language, as were some of her other 18-year-old companions. So this was an ideal time from, say, the age of reason, which has to be defined as like maybe around 18, up until somewhere in the 20s. Those people were they loved it. They liked it. It was something that tickled people's intellectual abilities. People had fun with the problem solving in linguistics and with the and with collecting in their own languages. It was something that was, I found, very, very easy to work with young people from, say, 18 to 30. It was easy. Working with people in their 60s and 70s was a whole different story, and was not particularly easy because of all kinds of other limitations. But the young people, that was absolutely, it was sort of completely painless. Everybody loved it. And there were some people who ultimately decided that it wasn't their cup of tea, that they didn't really love it. But at first, almost everybody did love it because, you know, linguistics has all these puzzles, and puzzles are fun, and people enjoyed those puzzles. And then they began to take it more seriously and to actually look into the puzzles as real keys to the grammar of the language. But at first, it was a lot of problem solving, and puzzling was very appealing to people of that age and that intellectual ability. So after then the war, which was over in 1984, I returned for the first time to Guatemala in 1985 after working on techo in Mexico. And interestingly enough, there was a meeting about Mayan linguistics that was held in Guatemala that summer. And I don't even remember who organized it, but it was a real opportunity to go and to sort of pick up where things had possibly been left before the war. And what I discovered there was, first of all, I met some new people, new actors in this whole field, completely new to me, people I'd never heard of. Two of them were Enrique Sam Colop and Demetrio Cochti. Enrique Sam Colop was at the time, young Quiche man who had recently gotten his degree in law at one of the universities and was very interested in his own language. And he came to me and he said, you know, I want to study linguistics. Nobody had ever said that to me before. And so how are you going to make that happen? Basically is what he said. And I did. I got him a scholarship to the University of Iowa, where I was at the time. And he started learning English and studying linguistics at the University of Iowa, got a master's, and went on to study literature and linguistics at Buffalo with Dennis Tedlock, who was quite who was an anthropologist who did a lot of work on Maya literature. And so I found that a wonderful experience for somebody to come to me and say, I want to do this. It's your field. You make it happen. And fortunately, I was able to make it happen. You can't always, but that time I could. And so I was able to live up to the expectations of this young man who turned out to be really very, very bright. He and very talented. He wrote and published his own version of the great Quiche literature, the Popol Vuh, and did some other work like that. He has passed away, unfortunately, but he did some work on his own before he did that. The other person I met at the time, Demetrio Cochti, was the first Guatemalan Maya to ever get a PhD. He studied in Louvain in Belgium and in communications studies, and got his PhD in communication studies, writing at that time and continuing to write really very incendiary literature about the political position of Mayas in the world and in Guatemala. He was then, from the time he came back from Louvain, which was 1982, until maybe 2000, the without doubt, the intellectual leader of something which has been called the Maya movement. He was very analytical. He was very, very good at political analysis. And he has written several things, which if you're interested in indigenous movements, you should read, because they talk about the Maya movement in Guatemala in really very sort of bare knuckle terms. And I think they were very good and very necessary for the Maya movement to have that kind of leadership. And I'd never seen anything like that before in Guatemala. When I was there before the war, people never even graduated from high school. There were almost, you could count on one hand the number of Mayas who had graduated from high school. And I come back and there's this guy with a PhD who's writing tomes about Maya politics. It was wonderful, and again, eye-opening. And I'm still very grateful that Demetrio went to Belgium and got his degree and used it to write about the political position of Mayas in Guatemala. It was a life work that was well worth doing. It was not, however, linguistics. Enrique Samkalop came much closer to linguistics in his own work. So then my question to myself is, okay, so what do you do now? Well, it seemed to me that what I needed to do was to start teaching more people and to teach them linguistics. We still needed to have people who were real leaders in linguistics. So in 1988 and 89, I convinced the Proyecto Lingüístico to run a couple of intensive 8-month-long training sessions. And I had leaves from my university for those years. So I was able to be there the whole time. And in 1988, we had 16 people that we taught. And in 1989, we had 25 people that we taught, and we taught them straight linguistics, and they all wrote grammatical sketches of their languages. Some of them went on to keep working in either education or linguistics. And some of them became sort of my TAs when we began to expand this whole model to even a bigger group. And that bigger group occurred in the 90s. In 1990, I got a Fulbright. And so I was in Guatemala for a year, teaching Fulbright. And besides teaching in one of the universities, and actually 2 of the universities, I took that time and to do more training. I mean, it seemed to me that my mission with regard to working with Mayas in Guatemala was, at this point, post-war, and with more and more people appearing who had a fairly decent education and so on, my mission was to get them some linguistics. So I started working toward that in the 90s. We first of all established the group OKMA, which stands for Oshlahuch Maya Achzit. And this just has always been just called OKMA by almost everybody. And we established that as a research group. There were about 7 people, 5 at a time, 6 at a time, who participated in that. And they were people from the 88 and 89 training who liked linguistics and were good at it and wanted to do it. And so we set up a way in which these people could continue, for which purpose I solicited financial aid from one of the private universities, the Universidad Rafael Landívar, who had money from USAID to spend on their projects. And one of the projects they decided to spend some money on was this. It was a small amount of money. It was like, I think, $40,000 a year, which, as you know, is not a whole lot to run a big grant. But it was enough money to have between 5 and 7 people on payroll the entire year, and get some computers and have them work. And so that's what we did. And I was there to help them over the rough spots, to keep teaching linguistics to them. And their goal was to ultimately write reference grammars of their languages, which they did. There are 5 reference grammars from that time, which were, for the time, the best grammars that had ever been written of any Mayan languages. They were really excellent. They were all somewhere about 450 pages each. They were published in Guatemala by a Maya press. And they were really very, very good. And so I feel eternally grateful and proud that I could participate in that project of writing reference grammars of 5 of the languages, and these reference grammars were written by speakers of the languages. Somebody needs to do this kind of project again, because we now know so much more about the languages, especially syntax, that they need to be rewritten. But this was, kind of state of the art at the time in 1996 and 7, which is when these things were ultimately published. So, so that was a real achievement in terms of linguistic production. The next thing we did was the whole group decided that they wanted to train a lot more people. So we did a training that Thelma participated in as a student of 45 people, which is an enormous class for this kind of thing. These classes run all day long from 8 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon. It's not like go to class for 2 hours and leave, it's all day, every day for, I believe, 10 months. I was there for 8 months of that. It's exhausting work, absolutely exhausting for everybody. I got smart with this particular training, and of the people that I'd been working with from 90 to 96 and who had written the grammars, I got them to be the TAs or the teachers. So I was a teacher and each of them was a teacher. There were about 6 of them. And so we teaching, one day it would be talking about whatever, and one of those guys would take the lead, and then we'd have practice sessions, and we'd have times in which everybody would produce what they knew about in their own language about the topic under discussion. And Thelma, you can probably remember what those days were like better than I can, but there was lectures and there were practices, and what else did we all do? Well, talk to each other. There was group work, right? And so there was a lot of
presentations.
Oh, that's right. At the end of each period of talking to each other and figuring stuff out, each group would give a presentation on how it worked in their particular language. And so we had the idea of being in class all day, every day would involve a number of different activities. It wasn't just lecture, for instance. And the end result of that was a lot of other kinds of work. Each of the groups wrote a book about the dialects in the particular language. They went out and did field work to figure out what the different dialects were and where they were and what the differences were, so that we have a fairly, I would say that in terms of publication, we have more information in those books about dialects than had ever been published before. I mean, all the historical linguists like Terry Kaufman, they had it all in their files and they knew about dialects, but they never published that stuff. And we went ahead and published it in books about, the dialects of Quiché, the dialects of Mam, and people went out and did the research to figure out what those differences were. And I think that's one of the most kind of exciting things we had done. Why? Because it also fed into what people wanted to do with the language, which was in part standardize, figure out a single way to read and write. And to standardize the language, you have to know what the differences are, right? How can you standardize it if you don't know what the different ways of speaking are? So in order to know what the different ways of speaking are, well, everybody knows that Mayan languages have lots of dialects, or at least most of them do. but they don't know what the details are. They don't know how is it different over here and over there. How do those guys 2 towns over, how do they speak that's different from me? Everybody will agree that the way they speak is stupid and funny and not the proper way to speak, but they won't agree on what the actual differences are. So, this group of 45 people went out and found out and wrote books that have maybe not all the details, but a bunch of the details in them. The other, and so that was one important thing that people worked on in that time. And it was important because it was straight out linguistics work. You have to know linguistics to be able to do that. But it was also work that people wanted to do because it was going to be of practical use to them when they figured out how to read and write in their languages. And so if the town down the way says something one way and you say it another way, which way are you going to write? Or maybe neither. Maybe it's going to be something else. But you can't make those decisions until you know something about the variation that exists. So that was one thing that happened with the big group of 45. The other thing I discovered was that people are very lax about standards for things like recording. So if you're ever in the field and you need to have a lot of recordings made, this is what happened to us a lot of times. We sent it, this is before the days of good recorders, but we had a lot of cassette recorders and we had some good microphones, and we sent people out with a crummy recorder, but a good microphone. And they didn't take any of that equipment with them because it was going to be too much to carry. You have to deal with realities of what people are willing to do and not do. And they did not want to take the good microphone because it would weigh something and it would mess up their luggage. Of course, I didn't discover this immediately. I thought, you give people a good microphone, of course they'll take it to the field. So you gotta watch out for the realities of life, which don't always involve taking with you every kind of electronic device that would actually make your work easier. Some of the cassette recorders were kind of big. They didn't want those. They wanted the little ones. We now have small recorders, but we still have big microphones. And I would not necessarily count on people taking those with them if they have to travel any different distance. You gotta check people and see what their priorities are. So some of our recordings could have been a lot better. But you discover these things after the fact. But it's just, I guess what I'm mentioning this for is you can't take anything for granted, okay? The fact that you have good microphones doesn't mean that people will want to use them. If it means carrying something everybody wants to minimize their luggage when they travel by bus or by foot. And if it means carrying an extra pound or pound and a half, then no way, forget it. I mean, obviously you can insist, but you have to know that people are leaving the microphones behind in order to insist. And I didn't know that at first. Okay, so we had this massive training in 1945. Quite a few of those people went on and are still in the field. And some of them went on to graduate school. So we have, from the people who worked in that field, we have, I believe, 4 people who have gotten PhDs, 1 in anthropology at Vanderbilt, 1 in linguistics at Kansas, 2 in linguistics here at UT. I may be forgetting somebody at the moment, but that's at least 4. And we have a bunch of people who have master's degrees that they got in various places, some of them here, some of them in Ciesas in Mexico, and 1 in Bonn in Germany. So people have been around for their education. And that's one of the things that these programs were useful for, is getting people situated so they could take advantage of opportunities for further higher education. And not everybody, but some people really, really wanted that. So getting a master's or a PhD in in some other university was very important to them. I think I'm gonna kind of stop here so I can see if you have questions, but the one I wanted to say that I think the guiding principle that I used throughout this period, which was from graduate school and getting a degree in 1975 up until we're now 20 years later at the end of the 90s, was if you see an opportunity, take it. Grab opportunities. I didn't always, this was not a plan. I didn't know that I was going to teach 45 people linguistics in 1997. But as soon as I saw any kind of opportunity, I took advantage of it and I grabbed it, and it worked. We got a lot of people who know a lot of linguistics and are good linguists, and they contribute to their own languages by being good linguists of their languages and also good speakers of their languages, and by writing about their languages and writing about them in a way that is basically unparalleled. They're not having to apologize to anybody. They're writing some of the best stuff around. And so when you see an opportunity for anything like this, take it, just organize it. Make sure you take advantage of all of the opportunities that come your way. Let's see if we have any questions that anybody wants to ask. And if not, I can talk some more, but maybe you have some questions.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, while you were talking, like for us that, came like after, some of the projects that you've been working on, we really kind of took, so you're saying that, that was something that you were not really planning on doing on like a training speakers. It's just an opportunity that happened, seeing all these young people that what they wanted to do is that they wanted to learn.
No, Emmy, that's not quite right. I was always planning to do the training, but these specific opportunities to do so changed over time. And so I was very focused on trying to make training happen, right? And so, the PLFM, the first project I worked on, was specifically for training. So it filled the bill, but then finding the rest of the opportunities to continue to do training was not always, there's nobody out there who says, oh, you'd like to do training of speakers of indigenous languages, here's some money. Yeah, that doesn't happen. So you have to be looking for those opportunities every step of the way. But yes, it was always something I wanted to do.
Okay. And I was like wondering about like, so like for us that we can kind of, later to this, like what we see is more of that, that part that is already being really established, right? Like that project that you, it was really solid by the time we kind of like side. And that was something really interesting because, and then, and we don't really know what it really went before that, because it's now that you're talking about like the being part of the war, like seeing people dying and all of those things that what we see is Nora, right, having very successful project, but in what we see is a success, and what we often don't know is that what it takes to be able to to do something like that, right? And I think at the all of us, we work in different scenarios, and often to be working in violence and in seeing people that their lives are like being put into the like in that border, like you talk about the river, and it just, I think it really helps me to put this in a different context and not just this like the success of something, right? To make it human in a way that we need to know that to to do this kind of work, we're not always like in this like perfect scenarios, right? And the people that we work with, they also, have their own struggles, but also seeing right at, all of these people like being willing or wanted, or, like going and doing all these amazing things. So I think that the last sort of the piece that we see is that. But now I see some other context, and it really helps me to understand some of these things. And also I would like to say too that many of us that we have been part of seeing this is that we learn from these things, but we all, have our own environment where we do our work, but we definitely see the project that you created as a model, and we took a lot of that to be able to kind of reproduce, not the same thing, but I think it was very solid, but the time went aside. And so thank you for, putting this human piece to that story.
Right. I mean, there is always this kind of backstory. It didn't just get born full blown, in a moment. There's all kinds of work that goes into it. And this whole thing of just grabbing opportunities. The opportunity that was given to me was the 2 years I worked on it at the beginning, where somebody was looking for linguists and I applied and I got accepted, and that was, none of my own effort. But after that, it was just looking for the opportunity and finding it, and always wanting to do this sort of thing. And yes, there's always a kind of a major backstory. The funding for this thing has come from all over the place, for this thing being training of native speakers in one way or another. So the funding has come from, as I mentioned before, USAID. It has come from a university in Guatemala. It has come from ELDP. It has come from the Norwegian Foreign Aid Mission. It has come from a number of different sources, and it always has depended not necessarily on me. It has depended on somebody, very frequently not me, making the case of why this work is important, especially since what everybody wants to do is build a bridge or a road, and this is not a bridge or a road in a physical sense. Gladys.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. At some point you mentioned that the speakers that you worked with, they were aware of the varieties and the different accents of their varieties. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about this. I'm particularly interested whether there was, whether you as a group with the speakers did some kind of linguistic study to work with the varieties, and whether that yields some results, or do I make sense?
Well, yes, we did dialect surveys, and where we would have, I think it was a questionnaire of something like 2,500 items, where we would ask them in different places and find out how people said those things in those different places, whether they're the same or different, and if they were different, how different, and what were the regularities of the difference. And we actually have represented us two concrete examples. Telma speaks a variety of Quiche, which is widely regarded as the best Quiche, and it's a very conservative, very dialect, which is often, or variety, often used for the standard. Lizzie, on the other hand, is working for the most divergent, well, second to most divergent dialect of Quiche that there is, which is the Quiche spoken in a town called Chichicastenango. And Lizzie has learned both the standard, the best Quiche, which she learned when she was taking Quiche courses here, and she's also been working on the very much non-standard. So they are very different, aren't they, Lizzie? Especially in phonology. the way
Yeah,
that,
often people who aren't used to Chichicastenango at first can't understand anything when I play them recording. So maybe Tilma, maybe for native speakers that's different, but other Quiche learners are like, what?
well, and Telma's nodding her head, so that suggests that maybe native speakers are kind of the same way, huh? But so there is, the point of that little anecdote is that there is some very wide differences in the varieties of some languages, not all. Some of the languages have very little difference and some have a great deal. Danny works on the language with the smallest language with the biggest variety. There's only 3 different towns where Ixil is spoken, and each one of them is radically different from the other. So that could be taken as the example of the biggest differences in terms of local varieties that exist among Mayan languages. And then there's others where they're spoken in, you know, a bunch of towns and there's hardly any difference at all. So it really depends on the language. Roberto?
Yes, thank you, Nora, for sharing this. I just had 2 brief questions. One, could you walk us through the timeline again? So you said that particularly the OKMA timeline. So that started.
OKMA started in 1990.
And that 45
ended in 2019.
Okay, 1990 to 2019, and that big 45
right.
group.
Or 2009. I'm sorry, it was 20 years.
20 years, 2009. Okay, and that big 45 group that started in, was it 95 or 97? 97. Okay.
And the chronology that I made has some of these.
Okay, I'll follow up.
I'll
follow up on that.
I don't know where Tony put it, but it's available somewhere.
Okay, and then my second and last question was if you could talk a little bit about some of you mentioned how you had to balance some of the interests, your own academic interests, as well as, you know, the interests of the native speakers. Last week, Gladys asked about some of the more practical challenges to this kind of work and working with native speakers. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about some of those challenges when maybe your own interests or academic interests conflicted with the needs or wants of some of those speakers, and if there were any instances where you did have those conflicts and maybe kind of how you resolved them or went about balancing them or redressing some of those tensions, so to speak, between your interests or other academics' interests and those of your native speaker consultants.
I don't think there was the kind of conflict you're talking about. The understanding among all of us was fairly clear that what we were going to contribute to was linguistics and the structure of the language of Mayan languages. And with that as a start off point, there wasn't a whole lot of conflict over interests, which is to say, if people were basically interested in bilingual education, then we didn't have the expertise to really participate in that. They needed to go somewhere else. So one of the tensions, if you want to put it that way, is to not overstep your footprint. We are not experts in everything. I don't know anything about primary education. I could not teach people how to deliver primary education in any language, their own or Spanish or anything else. Almost all of the people in the group of 97 were teachers. They knew a whole lot more than I do about that, but it would be absolutely foolish for me to pretend that I have any expertise in an area that I absolutely don't have any expertise in. And if what they want, for instance, is to know how to teach in their communities, then there are other resources they should go to, not to me. And I think you have to be clear about that. What is it that you're able to do and what is it that you're not able to do? And what I was able to do was teach the structure of the languages and teach people to figure out the structure of the languages on their own. One of the many things I was not able to do was teach people how to teach. I don't know anything about that in terms of, say, primary or secondary education. And I was also not able to, particularly to make materials for those years. However, a lot of the people that I worked with were trained as teachers and did make materials from the oral histories that we collected and things like that. So there are quite a lot of children's books running around Guatemala these days that were created by the people that I worked with because they had good stories to tell because they were collecting the stories from the elders. And so then they would write them down and make and get them illustrated appropriately and make children's books. But that's something that people want and know how to do. And I respect that, but I can't help them in the sense that I don't know how to do it. But what you can do is, provide some of the material and some of the time. But I don't think there's exactly the tension you're talking about. That tension arises when there's a complete misunderstanding of what is going on. Like people think that if you say a linguist does all these things that linguists don't do, like and wants the person from outside to solve everything. Well, don't set yourself up as an expert in everything, especially education. There are people in the communities who have had, they have had teacher training. They know about education. I don't know about it. I never stepped foot in a class in elementary education. I don't know anything about it. And for me to try to pretend that I could do that is foolish, and you will get caught because you don't know anything. So basically, don't offer people stuff you can't deliver on, is I guess the moral of my story there. But also you have to respect what people do want. And if they don't care at all about linguistics, but do care about education, maybe you're in the wrong community or in the wrong project, or so you need to do something else. I mean, if you can't sell what you've got, then, and nobody's interested in it, then maybe that's not the place or the time to do it. I don't know. I didn't have those problems because I didn't ever try to tell people that I know how to do things that I didn't know how to do.
I think we need to probably wrap it up for this time.
Well, there were two people who had outstanding questions, Tony. I think we should finish that.
All right, let's do that.
And we'll do it quickly. Lee.
Right.
Hopefully this will be pretty brief. Do you have any recommendations for grammars that are more recent that you feel like are really, really strong grammars to take as an example?
Patty. Just go to Patty's grammar. It's one of the best grammars ever written.
All right.
Sophie.
I'm wondering, so it seems like what you were doing was very radical, coming out of a civil war and teaching people how to read and write. I mean, there's something sort of incendiary about that whole sort of operation. And I'm wondering if you ever got in trouble from with sort of the Guatemalan elite or government and how you navigated that situation.
Yeah, you lie low. I never came to the notice of, I mean, and I that was a kind of a deliberate thing. I never came to the notice of people who were running government or who were the elite or anything for a very, very, very long time. And in a country like that, that's a good thing. You just don't want to come to the notice of a lot of people. And so you arrange not to. And it's pretty easy. I mean, you're some just stray gringo in a town or doing something and who cares, So, okay. It's break time, right, Tony?